David, every time Saul tried to kill him, he warned him what was happening next. And so it is today. Frank had to also forsake his father. He loved them, but had to forsake him, had to go another way. As he matured into consciousness, Frank Watkins, we will name the Frank Watkins Communications Frank Watkins Communications Department after Frank Watkins, hands together for Frank. Every time we had a battle, Frank was always there. St. Louis school strike last 27 days, we were there together. Free Mandela, corporate covenants, ACLC to push, Black Power, nationalism to Rainbow Coalition, his 88 campaigns. Frank was always there. Our pharmacist this week, Jesse calling, simple 5806, trying to get Frank on the phone. Some information. Frank will live as long as we remember him. We will not forget. Say Frank. Will live as long as we remember him. Will not forget. Appreciate God. Send Frank our way. I want to turn the program now to Jesse Jr., who will give the eulogy. Give it up for Jesse Jr., please.
I wish I could tell you, Lord, just what I want, and you give it to me, just like the truth of the matter. What I want just might hurt me, and you won't let me go out like that. You know my end before my beginning, and it's calculated blessings down to the penny. So Lord, I'll cry till you tell me to let it go, let it be. Found out your will, the way you got this thing, it's what's best for me. And no rubies and no diamonds, Lord, and no silver, no pearls. My Lord, there are some lessons that I had to learn that I wouldn't trade in for this world. You told me that my trials and everything that I go through, they only come to make me strong. Yeah, God. And then with this, you promised that while I'm dealing with this thing, you wouldn't leave me alone. So I'll cry. Yeah, Lord, I'm gonna cry till you tell me to let it go, let it be. Cause oh Lord, anybody just ever told God, your will, your will, your will, your will, your word is good God Almighty, and it's gonna last. Yes, it will. And you're gonna guide my future. Yes, you will, like you brought me out of my past. Yeah, there are times that I cannot see. But Lord, I know, yes, I know that it's so. I found out that you love me more. Yeah. You love me more than I'll ever know. Yeah. So I'm gonna cry till you tell me what you gonna let go, Brooks. All those things I can't change. All those things I wish was different. My arms are too short to box with God. Your will, your word. Good God Almighty, and it's gonna last. Yes, it will. Family, God's got your future. Yes, he does, just like he brought you out of your past. Here's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Down here, I'm gonna work real hard, but I might not get everything that I want, but I've made up my mind. I'm gonna trust God every step of the way, and he promised to never leave me. So I'll cry till you tell me, let it go. Those that know this song, sing it with me. Let's tell God, oh Lord, yes sir, Lord, the way you got this thing is what's best for me.
Have a slight adjustment in our program. We have the Prince of South Africa here with us, who has worked with us across the years. He knew Frank Watkins, and we would not want to move to the eulogist until we've heard from Hosea Matthews. And so won't you greet warmly a friend of ours, a former staff member. I call him the Prince of South Africa. Give him a warm round of applause. Flew all the way here to attend this memorial service. Following him, Darius will come back with another musical selection, and the next speaking voice you will hear will be none other than the Reverend Jesse Jackson Jr., who will bring the message of hope and comfort for all of us.
Good afternoon to the Push family, Mrs. Jackson and Reverend Jackson. I can definitely say it feels good to be home. 37 years ago, Mrs. Jackson and Reverend Jackson brought me from London to come and be in Chicago. And I spent some of the most fascinating, exciting, interesting times of my life, and had two older brothers that took me under their wing and guided me, Frank Watkins and Jack Odell. I want to talk about Frank from my perspective, how I knew him, the years that we spent together traveling with Reverend Jackson across the United States and across the world. Frank was, I can say, the intellectual architect of so much that is Reverend Jackson. If you want to be around Reverend Jackson, you've got to keep up with him intellectually. You've got to be able to have the energy, the intellectual fortitude to survive and to understand what exactly it is that he is building, what he's working towards. Frank was one of those people. In our country, we refer to people like Frank as stalwarts of the liberation movement, people who have dedicated and devoted their life to the achievement of a just and equal society. Frank Watkins was one of those. He didn't want to be out in front. He liked operating from the back, being able to think things through. Happiest when he was at his typewriter in those early days. I can remember his excitement when he went to Radio Shack and bought a Tandy computer. one of the very first early machines, and how excited Frank was to show us everything that it could do. He had a very Midwestern sense of humor. And I can remember one particular incident. Reverend Jackson and I traveled to Mozambique for the funeral of the late Samora Machel. And we had a journalist from the Washington Post, Walt Harrington, accompany us on this trip, who was writing a profile on Reverend Jackson. The article comes out, and he described me as intense and volatile. So I went to Frank. I said, Frank, this journalist says I'm intense and volatile. Frank looked at me and said, yes, you are. In that very dry Midwestern humor of his. But he took me under his wing, and not easy for a South African who'd never lived in America, traveling across the country. Frank always told me, make sure you eat something in the morning. Otherwise, you're going to go a long day without eating, and Reverend doesn't stop. So I made sure that I always tried to grab an early breakfast before he woke up. But he was a good friend and a good colleague, and somebody that I know how important he was to this organization, and also to Reverend Jackson personally. One of the funniest things was to be able to see the two of them get into an argument around a policy issue. And no one would win that argument, but I'd be sitting in the middle on the plane while they're arguing about this. And then Frank would turn away, and because he couldn't hear in one ear, he'd just ignore whatever Reverend was saying. But he was a special man, and he's going to be missed greatly. And I'm glad to have been able to have this opportunity to come and pay my own small tribute. Thank you.
Just ordinary people. God uses ordinary people. He uses people just like you and I, who are willing to do He commands. Help me, Santita.
God uses people who will give their all, no matter how small your might seem to you, because little becomes much when you place it in the Master's hand.
And I like this part right here, Santita. Just like that little lamb who gave Jesus all he had, like the multitudes were fed with the fish and the loaves of bread. But what we have may not seem much, but when we yield it to the touch of the Master's loving hand, then we'll understand how the life will never be the same. Just ordinary people.
God uses ordinary people. He uses people just like me and you, who are willing to do everything He commands. God uses It doesn't matter how small your might seem to you, because
Little becomes much as you place it in the Master's hand. In His hand, place everything you got in His hand.
There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. Maya Angelou. Frank's mother once asked him, "How did you get so political?" Frank said, in essence, I told her the following. I said, at home, you and Dad taught me and modeled positive values before me. You took me to church several times a week where I learned about the importance of morality and having a wide-ranging moral vision and commitment. Then you sent me away to school to become better educated, to learn how to use my mind, rationality, and logic. So when my family values and my religion taught me to care about the hungry in the richest nation in the history of the world, my education eventually led me to the agricultural department and its programs and policies. When my family values and my religious training discovered illiteracy, it was reasonable to go to the Department of Education to see if its programs and education policies were solving the problems of illiteracy, and they were not. When my family values and religious training discovered racial and gender discrimination, logic told me to go to the Justice Department and discover how it was or was not administering and enforcing voting rights, discrimination in employment, and equal educational opportunity policies. It wasn't doing a very good job. And when my family values and religious convictions led me to be concerned about peace in the world and just relations between nations, my training said go to the State Department and to the Defense Departments and decide if the diplomatic policies at State and the guns, bombs, and jet fighter policies at Defense contain the right balance to provide the best chance for achieving peace and justice around the world. And when my family values, religious perspectives, and education viewed Congress, I wanted to know if the laws they were passing were fair and just and would bring about the American dream and the beloved community that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. desired, because in the end, Dr. Cornel West articulates, justice is what love looks like in public. When I hear political conservatives, Frank said, argue for keeping the government out of the lives, and then I see the governor of Alabama sign the most anti-choice bill into law since 1973, Roe v. Wade, that will put the government directly into a woman's womb, all in the name of pro-life. And then I watched her push the button for the 6th time this year, killing another man on death row. Mom, that violates the family values you taught me, the morality I learned in church, and the logic imparted to me in school. So yeah, Mama, that's how I became so political. Frank and I used to talk about my dad a lot. Frank began working with my dad in 1969 as a volunteer. I was born in 1965. That means Frank has been involved in my life for 53 years. I used to tell him how difficult it was being Jesse Jackson Jr., and he used to work with me through any confusion that I may have had on the matter. He told me the day that I got elected to Congress after having run a successful campaign in 1995 for me, along with Del Marie Cobb, who I am grateful who's here today, that the difficulty in my life was just beginning. Dad shortly thereafter changed his name to Jesse Jackson Sr., and I began to understand. I concluded that I wanted to develop my own personality very publicly and define myself very differently. I wanted to distinguish myself from my father, not distance myself, but I had a God-given right to be my own man. In the 17 years that I had the privilege of serving in Congress with Frank, as my communications director, I had only 10 press conferences. That's less than one press conference a year in 17 years. It does not mean that I did not enjoy the media or like the media. It just means that from Frank, I learned the importance of controlling your story. I did not want to be consumed by Dad's narrative, and I had my own children to raise, and I wanted them to appreciate my contribution. So we thought of other ways, op-eds, editorials, the Congressional Record, but most importantly, the most significant method of communication so that I might tell my own story was to be known for my work. A near-perfect voting record, and delivering resources to the people of the 2nd Congressional District. To be known for your work. The best way for me to distinguish myself was to do the work of ministry and to be the work of ministry. To be, Frank said, mattered theologically. Of course, the hardest part of the work of ministry is to be. For one's own words, one's own actions, one's own deeds, to be consistent is the highest form of theology. That is what Frank taught me. There were many mistakes along the way, Eric, but Frank convinced me, Marty, that life was an experiment and that we had the power to transform our personal stories into something great. In fact, the Bible was filled with these characters and stories. While in college, Frank participated in taking over a class from the professor of a conservative seminary and putting together the curriculum around Tillich, Dr. Wallace, Barth, Kierkegaard, Whitehead, and other radical biblical scholars. He participated in the anti-war and workers' rights movements and got his arrest for the first time engaging in nonviolent protests. That is the activism. Is probably why Frank was denied and rejected being the pastor of 5 different churches. They did not want Brother Penn, his kind of preaching. Therefore, whenever I asked Frank to do anything for me, to write a letter, to help with a speech, write an op-ed, I knew that his writing would be processed through the existentialism and the socialism of Paul Tillich. I understood that Karl Barth, who rejected the idea that God chose some people to be saved and other people to be damned, that God could not have possibly put each and every one of us in that position, I believed. Frank took deep dives into Harrington and liberationist theologies like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I understood Frank would process everything that I asked him to do for me through the father of existentialism and universalism, Soren Kierkegaard. And I understood that Whitehead's mathematics and logic and science would be applied along with other radical biblical scholars. I asked Frank to do something, and I knew that it would be processed through that system. As a brilliant philosopher and theologian and scholastic and academic, as Frank was, he was a very practical man, Reverend Hardy, a practical theologian. His life was ministry. Hazel, no frills. Ray, no complications. Just an inherent goodness within and the determination to make a difference, period. To make a meaningful difference in the world, Andy. He was honest. He once said to me, "Dad, I use your dad." He said, "I believe your dad is the best vehicle that is available to bring change in the world." He said, as Hulsey Matthews argued, Your father and I would agree, we would disagree, but the consensus we reached was world-changing, and I'm okay with that. Frank and I struggled over words and spirit. I used to share with him that there was a problem with the English language. It is probably the newest language in human history of world languages, but the English language is extremely complicated, Mama. And that so many things mean so many things to so many different people. It is the fastest spreading language in the world, and in that language spreads misconceptions, misinformation, truth and lies, fact and fiction, and there's hope and there is despair. Joel Covell said, there is differentiating and splitting in the English language, and no one knows that better than Native Americans. An Indian treaty don't mean nothing. Frank came down heavy on the side of action, Del Marie, over words. Words matter to Frank. Bringing words together with actions is what defines the life of Jesus Christ, and I believe defines the ministry of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., where their words and their actions come together in near perfect harmony, but nevertheless, it is still an imperfect experiment. That was Frank's understanding. I believe the source of his genius, a simple man, Kanu, a simple life, but a clear mission, far from being the materialists that many of us want to be, or even the material that we wanted to enjoy. Frank had a critique of materialism that mattered, Abe, in his life. He gave money away, Marty King. He understood that money was far more important to the people he gave it to than it was to him, because that was, Betty, not the essence of who he was. But on the question of words and action, no one spoke clearer about this than Dr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor in The Substance of Things Hoped For. Frank and I used the following story in A More Perfect Union. I used the same story in my most recently released book, The Finger of God, because inherently we understood this struggle, Judge. Dr. Proctor said, one of my white students entered an elevator that I was already in, and I removed my hat. Dr. Proctor, she said, why in the hell did you take your hat off? And when I got off the elevator, she said, you're living in the Victorian age. She laughed then congenially. If you get off the elevator with me, Dr. Proctor said, for a moment I'll tell you at my stop. We both stepped off, JJ. I'm not a Victorian, Dr. Proctor said, but some things stay in place from one generation to another, and certain manners stand for values that I hold dear. I believe that a society that ceases to respect women is on its way out. Women bear and raise our children. They are bound by them in early infancy. They need our support and security through this process. When we forget that the keystone of family and home is lost if we don't respect women, when we neglect and abuse women, the family falls apart and children are less well parented, and they fill up jails and are buried, Reverend Hardy, in early graves. I believe that respect for women is the linchpin of a family and a society, Dr. Proctor said. Therefore, when you enter the elevator, I wanted you to have automatic, immediate, unqualified assurance that if the elevator caught fire, I would help you get out through the top first. If a strange man boarded the elevator and began slapping you around and tearing your clothes off, he would have to kill me first. If the elevator broke down and stopped between floors, I would not leave you in here. If you painted and slumped down to the floor, I would stop everything and get you to a hospital. Now, it would have taken a lot of time to say all of that, so I just removed my hat, and I meant all of the above. Tears began to spring up in her eyes with some values, Dr. Proctor said, that abide. They have no racial or ethnic label. It took a lot of time to convince students that equality was possible, but we first had to define the optimum human condition and call everyone to embrace it in English. In the English language. A language that they understand, Professor. A new language that's rarely 400 years old. And so much is lost and hinged on a single word. Proctor showed us that actions speak thousands of words by taking off his hat. My daughter was one day on her way to class, and I thought about this loving story that Dr. Proctor and Frank and I heard from Dr. Proctor, and she was a student at UCLA, and I called her to tell her that I love her. I said, "I love you, Jessica." Then she was in such a rush, she hung up. When she called back, she said, "Daddy, I'm sorry, I was running so late. I wanted you to know that I had to get to class on time." And I shared with her that I wanted her to understand that when I said I love you, the words truly do not capture everything that I feel about you. I want you to have an unqualified assurance that you don't have to rush for anything. That as long as I'm alive, there is safety and security in your space. You don't need a boyfriend. You just need to get your lesson. Don't worry about a job. As long as I'm alive, you will have something to eat and you will have a roof over your head. Whether you get an A or a D or anything less than that, I'm proud of you no matter what. I really don't have a lot of time to tell you that my love for you represents in those 3 words in the English language, but in them, Tammy exists all of eternity. Mom, I gave Frank the highest honor of my life that I could bestow upon anyone, the right to speak for me. The right to tell my story. I've never asked anyone else to ever tell my story. I only gave one person the right to speak for me. Frank and I spent a lot of time drafting amendments to the Constitution that hinge on a single word. One amendment to the Constitution took 100 days to amend. Another constitutional amendment took 100 years to amend. Amendments to the Constitution are just a function of time and convincing the American people of their radical importance. Frank and I had to anticipate what a future Supreme Court might look like, one that we would not live to see. The language had to be plain and on its face and understood by the American people, and how a future court might interpret the language. That's just how serious we were about words, stories, and press conferences. The most precious right that we have is the right to remain silent and to pick and choose the words that we want to define ourselves and our life's work. We look very closely at the background of 3 African American women who were final contenders for Joe Biden's pick, and we concluded that Ketanji Brown Jackson would be the best interpreter, Kenneth Edmonds, Kenneth Johnson, of our language. Being black wasn't good enough. We needed someone in the lineage of Pauli Murray, Constance Baker Motley, Thurgood Marshall, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. In conclusion, Fay Humes, one of Frank's best friends, said, Frank came to Chicago to work his last campaign for Jonathan. He stopped taking his cancer treatment and stopped taking his medicine. He caught pneumonia, returned from Chicago with COVID, pneumonia, very sick. And they rushed him to the hospital where he checked himself in twice and checked himself out twice. And finally he returned and never left. On Wednesday, September 14th, at 6:41 p.m., I received this text message from Frank. Words and spirit. Please communicate to the entire Jackson family, all of the gratitude, all of the joy, faith, and love that the entire family has shown me. Love you all. I called everybody I knew. Is Frank okay? I said, please call Frank. And then Frank texted me, please stop. Only calls from the family, please. Exhausting. I said, okay. I can't read the damn thing. I said, just hold on, buddy. Take your time and breathe. Please know that I love you. Everything that I am and everything that I became, you gave me strength and the courage. It didn't mean to let us down. Praying you forgive me. Focus on your breathing. Breathe each breath, breathe carefully with intention. Please know that I love you. Everything I am and everything that I have become is because of you. Didn't mean to let us down. Praying for you to forgive me. Frank responded, please send the note to your family, please, in capital letters. It's done, Uncle Frank, it's done. The next morning, he responded, still here. I told him I take breathing classes. I control my anxiety. Slow, deep, controlled breaths in my nose. Slow, controlled exhales through my mouth. I know COVID is respiratory. Please, Uncle Frank, control your breathing and get more oxygen that way. You can beat this thing. You're stronger than Dad. He beat it. You can beat it. You just can't give up. Don't give up. Frank responded, doing my best. I said, that's a lot. If you're doing your best, deep, slow, intentional breaths. I was told that lying on your back made breathing difficult. If you can, where you can, sit up. Don't let pneumonia settle into your lungs. Put up a fight, buddy. I'll fight with you. Your life matters, buddy. Everything will spiral out of control if anything happens to you. We're all part of the same psychological fabric. We need each other. You have to make it. There's no one else who reads and writes around here, just a bunch of talkers. Hey, buddy, September 15th at 5:07. How are you today, man? No response. Doing my best was Frank's last message. But I can't get out of my mind. Still here. God bless you, Uncle Frank.
Let's stand and give a round of applause. Come on, let's celebrate the life of Frank Edward Watkins. Come on. Come on, let's do it together. Well,
I can fly higher than an eagle. You as a wind beneath my wings. Thank God for you. Thank God that you're the wind beneath my wings.
Now may the grace of God and the sweet communion of the Holy Spirit rest, rule, and abide henceforth and forevermore. And every heart said amen. One more time for Frank Edward Watkins.
If everyone could take their seats for just literally 1 minute. I want to acknowledge the staff of the Rainbow Coalition. Representative Davis, it's good to see you today. Will the staff of the Rainbow Push Coalition please stand wherever you are, just so that we can acknowledge you and give you a great round of applause. I want to acknowledge the staff of the 2nd Congressional District of Illinois, who's present, who worked with Frank for more than 17 years on Capitol Hill. Everyone who worked on that staff, please stand. Del Marie Cobb, part of that family. Give these wonderful public servants a great round of applause. And obviously, there's probably only 2 or 3 people, maybe 4, maybe 5 here, who had the great privilege of starting with Frank at Operation Breadbasket. Mama, Dave Wallace, Reverend Hardy, Hazel Thomas, Dad. Am I missing anybody because I can't see? Please stand so that we can acknowledge you. Betty Maggs, I knew you were here. Betty was there when I was born. Give them a great round of applause, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Is there a repast upstairs in the community? I understand that there's a repast in the community hall, just up the stairs or up the elevator, and we look forward to greeting everyone there. Please come. Please come. Let's fellowship.
When the saints go marching in, oh, when the saints go marching in, when the saints go marching in, Lord, I want to be in that number. When the saints go marching in, oh, when they crown him Lord of Lords, when they crown him Lord of Lords, Lord, I want to be in that number. When they crown him Lord of Lords. Oh, what he's done for me. Oh, what he's done for me. Oh, what he's done for me. I never shall forget what he's done for me. When the saints go marching in, when the saints go marching in, Lord, I want to be in that number. When they crown him Lord of Lords, when they crown him Lord of Lords, I want to be in that number. When the saints go marching in.